Welcome to Season 8 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from around the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. So welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by the fabulous Isabel Engels, and I can say that because she was a former student. She is a leader at Auxilium, an organization that aims to alleviate the housing crisis by providing high quality and affordable housing across the UK. Isabel's interest in housing as a vehicle for social justice can be traced back to her late teens in South America. Isabel was born in Argentina and grew up in Brazil, and she worked with an NGO to build over 20 houses in the favelas of Latin America. I'm so excited to have this conversation. Welcome to the show, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Anita, for having me. It's good to see you and hear from you after so much time.
Yeah, you look great. I'm so proud of you. I'm so excited. We've never had a conversation about housing on Purposeful Empathy. And in preparation for this, I started to do a little bit of research. I mean, here I am in Montreal, you're in London. London's very expensive housing market. Montreal always was very affordable within Canada. And all of a sudden, over the last couple of years, it's exploded. People, bidding above asking price that was unheard of, rent prices going through the roof. And so I'm paying attention on a personal level. And then I'm seeing that this is happening in the world. So some of my research, I just want to ask you to respond to some stats that I came across that I found super insightful, starting with the UN. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has an Article 25 that says, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So in other words, according to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, housing is a human right. Okay, so that's an important frame to think about for this conversation. Now, the three stats that really caught my attention, and I'd love to hear from you about this, is that by 2025, so that's like a few years from now, according to the World Bank, the housing crisis could impact 1.6 billion people. The UN Habitat predicts that the world needs to build 96,000 new affordable homes every day to house the estimated 3 billion people who will need access to adequate housing by 2030. And then in a study of 200 cities globally, 90% were found to be unaffordable to live in, with the average home costing more than 3 times the average income. So this work that you're doing is so important. What have you got to say just hearing all of that?
Yeah, I think, living in London which is one of, if not the most expensive city, alongside New York and Singapore, Hong Kong, it is extremely difficult to find not only something to buy because of the way that the lending system works, at least in this country, but even something to rent. And so the UK government at least has done a lot to try to incentivize first-time buyers from a lending perspective, so that they can get into the housing market and own their own home. But to be honest, it's still so far-fetched for so many people. And to be honest, when it comes to, I just wanted to take a point as to what the UN kind of quotes as a human right. When I was working with Teto back in Brazil, I used to think that education was the most important thing, and that with education you can move forward and exit that cycle of poverty that someone could find themselves in just because of where they were born. But to be honest, unless you have a house, unless you have somewhere that you can sleep, somewhere that you can not have running water going through your house in the middle of the night, or if it rains, you're not getting soaked, or or a lot of the diseases that people experience in favelas is because of the situation of their home. So it kind of created this mentality in my head of housing is the pillar that allows people to change their anything within their life. If they don't have affordable and even sustainable accommodation, it doesn't allow them to do anything else, to focus in education, to focus in health, to focus in anything. So it's extremely important. I think it is the most important part, which is why I always wanted to work in this space. I just had no idea how, and was very fortunate to just kind of find myself in this situation. And to be honest, like in the UK, in terms of like some stats, like there's like 30,000 refugees currently staying in like hotels and Airbnbs because there's just not enough accommodation. UK is a prime example of this problem. It's an island which is very small and it's very dense. And there has to be a construction of 200,000 homes, new homes, so new builds every year. And it's not even, I would say not even 10% of that is happening. And also like, there's not just the actual construction of them, but then there's the entire lending side that most people don't really take into account when it comes to housing. That doesn't usually coincide with the necessity that exists in housing. So yeah, just a few comments about the importance of having housing for society to be able to get out of this like circle of poverty, and also to decrease a little bit the gap between the poor and the rich, but then also the availability of it in general, and the actual government capacity to influence developers and people to just create new homes. It's very difficult.
And here's where, like I put the emphasis on purposeful empathy. And I feel like what you're talking about, so many policies, public policies, can either exacerbate it or actually ameliorate the situation. And if people are intentional about realizing what the impacts are for people who don't have access to affordable housing, we have to put a little bit more purposeful emphasis in this space. Like for me, this is like a brand new thing to think about. Housing, I never really kind of gave it much thought, but I really look forward to our conversation and understanding sort of some of those levers in a second. But before we do all of that, could you take us back to the original work that you did in the favelas? Can you kind of share where you were at in your head as a teen, and like what kind of inspired you and what that experience was like and all that learning and wonderful stuff?
Yeah. So honestly, it kind of happened the same way that I got into what I'm doing now. It was out of sheer coincidence, and it was kind of meant to be. I was kind of nowhere when I was in my teens, to be honest. I didn't really think like, oh, I want to, work with social impact. I didn't really understand, to be honest. It wasn't very clear to me. I lived a very privileged life in Brazil, and it was very separated. It's not, São Paulo is a little bit different to Rio. Rio, you can see it, it's very much there. In São Paulo, it's a little bit more segregated. So I never really experienced the poverty and the levels of poverty that existed, and my responsibility towards them as well. So when I graduated not university, but boarding school in the UK, and I decided to take a gap year, I ended up going to Brazil to work with my father in renewable energy. And I went to like a fashion show or something, and this girl that was there was like, oh, you should come and join us next weekend. We're going to go build a house. And I had seen on Facebook, the power of social media, I had seen on Facebook that some of my friends from my school had gone and done this experience. And I was like, why not? So I got home and signed up, and I went by myself. And it didn't really hit me until I got back home, the intensity of what I had just seen. Like I used to think that people in the favelas were people that were lazy and didn't have education, and I could not have been more wrong. Like the woman that we were building a house with, she worked for Itaú, which is one of the biggest banks in Latin America, if not the biggest bank in Latin America. And I just like couldn't quite understand how had just lost her husband a few months ago and had a few kids, and worked in Itaú, could be in that situation. It was very difficult to process. And so I kind of immersed myself into being part of this organization and becoming friends with the volunteers that were doing it, and ended up doing lots of things with them throughout the course of my gap year. And then after my first year at McGill, I ended up going back and being like the leader of a community in which you organize for the construction of these houses. And so you have to understand all of the story of all of the families that are there, and then also, picking who's gonna get the house and who's not. Which is not an easy task, because it's very emotionally draining, because you get really attached to these families throughout this process. But it was all of those experiences that kind of went accumulating through those years that I was working with that, to kind of created a light bulb moment in my head that made me realize, like, I had to, in some way or another, near or future, I would have to work with social impact, because that was like the purpose as to why I was brought to this earth. It was just like too much. It was like, it honestly saved me as well. Like, I've experienced so much emotional connection from the people that were in those situations, that it made me realize that my problems were no problems at all, and that I needed to just get on with it and try to do my best to help as many people as I could, because I was in a situation that I was able to do so. So that's a little bit as to what I experienced. I mean, very summarized, because there was like a bunch of other things, but like I did lots of different roles within Teton, and it was really inspirational to have worked with them and to be so close to the impact.
I want to pick up on two threads from this. One is, I just want to ask a question. It's almost like a kind of devil's advocate, critical question. There's some people that might say, oh, this privileged girl, the white savior complex goes in and builds favelas, in this town, and then like moves on to London, right? So like, I want to kind of hear what you have to say to address the whole idea of like what it means to like, to do social impact work. That's one. And then the other thing is, I actually want, which I think will go in tandem, but like to talk about what it really meant for those families who gained the houses, that got built, as difficult as it was to make the decisions about which families did get them. But like, how did that change their lives? So if you could just address those.
Yeah. So for the first one, when I was at McGill, I was just after the first semester, I was heavily thinking about quitting McGill and going back to Brazil. And I had a phone call with my dad asking, saying like, look, I don't think I should be here. I think I should go back and be helping out with that, because I just don't find like this is bringing anything to anyone's lives. Like, what's the point of this? I was having a real moment of I don't even know how to explain it, kind of purpose. I don't even know how to explain, of like not being able to understand like everything I had just experienced, and the intensity and how much you had impacted those people, that you had no idea that you could create so much impact, to going and studying and having a bunch of people like drink and that's all you would do. And so I was like, what's the point of this? And my dad told me, do you want to help 100 people, or do you want to help thousands? And unless you prepare yourself and create a situation that allows you to help thousands, you're only going to help 100. So you can come back to Brazil and you can feel good about going and helping out the people and being very close to the impact. But I thought you wanted to help as many people as possible. So you need to go through this trajectory. And honestly, like living in London, unfortunately, Brazil is very difficult to create startups. Very, very difficult. There's a lot of government regulation that makes it just difficult to have people that work in an organization that you're the director of or the founder of or whatever. And I wasn't quite ready to go back. I've always thought of creating like an NGO that would help people from favelas. That it exists actually in Argentina. It's called Fundación Pescar, and they help create skills to people to then have a job at the other end of that. And I always thought that would be so valuable as like the add-on to housing. But I was like, that's something I want to do a bit later on. So the point about like moving to London is that it allows, and ended up doing what I'm doing, is it allows to scale and to impact so many more people that you would have been able to do so from being more grassrooted perspective. So that's how I think of that question. And so it just depends as to what your goals are. I mean, I would be super happy, being in São Paulo and working with Teto, but wouldn't necessarily fulfill my accomplishments. And if you're not well within yourself, you can't be doing good for other people. So I think you have certain components, and each people have different components that you need to accomplish and to satisfy yourself, and then you can then go and help others. So it just depends what different people want to do with their own lives. I think is what differentiates being able to go somewhere else, like live in London or stay in São Paulo. It was very much that goal orientation that guided me here. And the second question, I'm going to have to ask you to remind me what it was.
Just the impact it had to have housing.
Yes. Right. So I just told the story a little bit as to when I got back from my first year at McGill. And this community, and it was not in any reach the worst community I've had been to. Sorry, the favelas, we call them communities back in Brazil. And it was quite clean. It was okay. It was close to the beach in São Paulo, so it wasn't anything like too crowded, but it was still a community, and the houses were still very precarious. We don't build houses for the people. That's not really what it is. We build with them. And that's how we choose who we build with, because they have to participate. They have to feel that they have ownership in this house, and it wasn't just given to them. Because that's, in Spanish, asistencialismo. That is basically donations, which you don't feel like it's yours when you do that. And so the whole idea of that is that you're creating some kind of like self-respect as well. It was really incredible when I went back like a year later, just to like see how everyone was doing. We had created a library. The community had worked together and created a library, which was an insane thing to see. Because that's one of the objectives is for the community to become a community. That's why we call them that. It's not for them to be like their own little individual families, and instead of them to feel like they can do something together. So being able to go back and feel like they were empowered was really nice. Yeah.
Beautiful. I love that. Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. So I would love to know the work that you're doing now. It's almost a decade later, so I don't want to say how old you are, but or how young you are, how fresh and young and vibrant you are. But you're still working in social housing. Now you're in London. So what does the company do, and what's its mission and goal and dream?
So the mission for both companies, because even though it's two separate companies, they work in conjunction, and from the beginning it's to be able to house as many people as possible. That is literally the one objective that we have, and what drives us forward is that. It's great. We've helped to house, because we don't own the properties, but we've helped to house around 120 people. We have another pipeline for another 100, which is awesome. But basically what we do is we provide a turnkey solution for clients, be it existing landlords or investors who want to buy properties or have existing properties in the UK and want to have a social housing contract attached to that property. So the way that social housing works in the UK, it's extremely complex, and in every country it works in different ways. I know that Switzerland has a very specific social housing, and so does the US like way of working. But basically in the UK you have affordable accommodation, which is when these developers will build their own will build properties, and 40% of those properties or units are to be used in affordable and shared accommodation. And usually these housing associations will then own those properties. Then you have temporary accommodation, which is a little bit of what we do, which is when housing association, they can own them, but they can also lease them. So it's kind of like a combination between the private and the public sector, or the private and the social sector, in which private landlord will own that property. And then these housing associations, which kind of act as intermediaries between like the government and the landlord, will rent out that property from the landlord and tenant them out to vulnerable people. So it can be asylum seekers, it can be domestic violence, homelessness, I mean, ex-offenders, like the list is non-exhaustive. It can be a whole bunch of different things. And so we basically opened these companies because we saw that there was like a bit of a space in the market, in which people don't necessarily understand the social housing space. There's lots of, I thought this property had to be in a really bad area, which it totally doesn't, because that means that's too high antisocial behavior. So you need to have it in somewhere where it's actually quite nice. So there's a lot of misconceptions about the social housing space that we actually end up educating a lot, our clients or people who come to talk to us about social housing, so they can understand what to actually expect and what they're actually getting into. And more importantly, these housing associations are extremely complex entities in themselves. There's registered providers, there's charities, there's these things called CICs or CBSs, and each structure will determine how much rent they can claim and to who they claim it. Because it's not necessarily that the tenant is paying the housing association with the money that they collect through universal credit. That can be, you can have a normal AST, which is like a normal contract as a landlord with a private tenant directly, and they are social housing tenants because they're paying half of their or however amount of their rent with universal credit. But so like that's it's like there's lots of different spaces and things that can be done, and there's a lot of horror stories because of things not being maintained well or tenants not being taken care of well enough. So you have to know the players, and you have to know which ones are the right ones and which ones are the wrong ones. And a lot of the due diligence that we do within our organization is to make sure that we're working with sustainable and good ones, so that we make sure that there's enough support workers to the tenants, that there is enough, that the rent that they're giving us is actually sustainable and it's not taking money out of their support. Because literally £1 can make a difference between the tenant having toilet paper or not, for example. I'm just giving an example out of the blue, but it really, like, every pound matters. And like, unless you understand how that rent gets circled down all the way to the landlord, you won't really know why that's the case. So having kind of an intermediary between private landlords and the social space is what we do in order so that we can house more vulnerable people in the UK, basically.
And I hear sort of like a bit of a systems thinking approach where there's some wraparound, like the fact that you care not just about sort of like, here's the real estate or the house or the apartment or the flat, like go live your life. Yeah. It sounds like you actually care about the well-being of the people living in whatever place that you're providing so that they can, achieve something beyond just the house.
Yeah, like I mean, it's important if you have a social business that you care about the social impact that you're creating. Again, like, it's a business. The business in itself has to make money, but like the experience of our clients and the experience of the tenants and making sure that the tenants have a good home is what's going to allow for the sustainability of that contract. If the home isn't good and it's falling to pieces, that contract is going to go away. And so the sustainability of that investment for the client is going to go away. So it goes together. It's not one or the other. It's both or nothing. Which I understand is not necessarily always the case with social impact, but I'm very happy that it's the case with our space.
Beautiful. Since this is a podcast devoted to empathy, I'll ask the question, which may be perhaps somewhat obvious, but I'd love to hear you express it. What role does empathy play in the work that you're doing?
If there is no empathy and there is no sense that you care about the tenant, there is no space for it. You can't work in impact and not have empathy, have gone through empathetic experiences, have dealt with difficult and very positive empathetic experiences, I think, because there's a bit of both. And as we were talking about before, as we were catching up, like there is a sense that there's a need of this empathetic circle. Like, you are not just giving to them, but they're giving back to you too. And within my space currently, like, we're a little bit separated from the tenant. We know that there's impact that we're creating, and we know that we're changing in some way their lives, and all the entire network that surrounds us is creating that impact. But all of the work that I did with Teto and the proximity that you have with people that are in need gives you so much purpose and so much life and so much appreciation for what you have, that it's really the fuel that kind of keeps you going. So if there is no empathetic journey and no empathetic moment, you don't really have the fuel to do impacts work. And I think it's very much just like I was talking about before about the property and having and the contract and having a good properties for the tenants. It's the same thing. You need to have both to be able to work in this space, and you have to care. Even if you're a business person, you have to care.
So, okay, I was going to ask my final question of the interview, but now I'm going to, sneak in a penultimate question just because you've inspired me here. I wonder if you could speak to two groups of people simultaneously. So I think of, young people who are growing up in the world today. There are still some kind of, some types of careers that have existed for a long time and have like these big headers like lawyer, accountant, doctor, whatever. And that there's still a funnel of people traveling that route, whether it's kind of society that expects them or maybe some parental expectations or whatever. Yeah. And you had your own experience where you found a bit of your calling thanks to a lived experience that you shared earlier. So I want you to speak to that group of people to see whether or not you could kind of nudge them to reflect on, what they could be doing with their lives differently. And simultaneously, if it's not too big of an ask, I still feel that there are a lot of people who are full on in their careers. They have mortgages, they're raising families, they're working, in their jobs, and may not be feeling particularly fulfilled. And I know that COVID, there's this big conversation around the Great Resignation and people are reflecting on, what's their purpose in life. But I also think even that group of people sometimes just need a little bit of a nudge to say that you can bring all your talent to something that could be so enriching for both sides of the equation. Just go for it. So what would you say to that?
This is a difficult question. This is not an easy one to answer, I have to say. I used to work for a corporate. I worked for SAP for 2 years because that's the trajectory I thought I had to go through. There's not many vehicles, be it in an impact or anything else about pursuing your passions. There's not many vehicles that allow you to pursue that passion. And to monetize that passion, because we have to live and we have to have a house and food and etc. And vacations and enjoy ourselves as well, and if you're working in something that you're not passionate about, I know it's like the most cliche kind of, you have to work with what you're passionate about. And it's so much easier said than done. And it's a lot of cases, people just don't know what their passion is. So to people that don't know what their passion is, my advice is just go and do different things. Because to be honest, I never thought I'd go and build a house in a favela ever until I actually went and did it. And I never, ever thought I'd ever own a company because of the risk, because of the stress, which is all true, by the way. So I never, you have to go do things that you never think that you would do, because if you don't do that, then it's very difficult to get out of that circle that you're in. Mm-hmm. And you won't necessarily find your passion right away. Sometimes it takes years. And not only from when you find it to until you understand how to monetize it. So I knew when I was 19, because I think 19, 20, that I wanted to work with social impact, but I thought it was going to take 7 years for me to monetize it, because I thought I had to work in corporate and then MBA and then impact fund. So and then some things it happens if you put yourself out there. So I put myself out there to go to like a property conference, which is why I ended up creating this business, was because of that. So you have to put yourself out there into situations that you wouldn't have otherwise if you want to change your situation. I think there's a saying that says you can't expect anything different if you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. So like you gotta, I think that kind of addresses both, but it's a very difficult question to answer. So I mean, I hope I did a little bit. But to be honest, I don't even know myself. Sometimes I wonder, like, what am I doing? Like, how am I doing this? Is this even going to work? Like, is it like, I don't know. I think we're all kind of just trying to row through life and figure out that what we're doing is worth it and it's fulfilling what we think is our purpose. But having a purpose, and for me, having goals and an objective and a sense of fulfillment is the most important thing, and the reason why I yet haven't quit doing what I'm doing.
Beautiful. Oh my gosh, some sage advice from the Fountain of Youth. Isabel, I'm going to ask you the last question of the interview, and thank you again. I know it's like late in the evening or getting towards dinner time for you in UK. You've just come off this major heat wave. I'm glad that things are back in the 20s and not in the high 30s anymore. Sounds like it was a really rough patch there for Europe, and a reminder that we need to pay attention to climate change. But okay, we'll leave that for the moment. Can you tell me a story or a time when you felt the positive effects of empathy and what that meant for you?
The experience of the organizing the 1620 houses after my first year at McGill. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to explain like your emotions in words. I'm going to try. But yeah, sometimes it's difficult to explain. It was a very emotive experience. So one of the families that we were working with, it was her and her grandson, and her grandson had dengue and a bunch of other humidity diseases because their house was a disaster. There was water flowing all over it. I mean, it wasn't really a house; it was just covered like cardboards put together and the bed, and it was really bad, and it smelled really, really bad. And the reason why her grandson was living with her was because she used to be a drug addict, and she had a child who was also a drug addict, and her child was going to sell her son for drugs as he was being born. So he was going to sell him and get drugs. And her grandmother found out and went to the hospital and took the baby, and then they ended up living together. But since then, they had the mother, her job. I mean, she would pick up the cans in the beaches. But the life had been so horrific, and he had all of these diseases, that I only found this out towards the end after like 4 months of working with her. But she had bought rat poison to kill herself and her grandson. And she wrote us a letter. I found out because she wrote us a letter saying this, and that Teto had given her back the will to live, and what we had done had given her back the will to live. And it was like, what? How can a person who's 19 years old have that power? Like, it was just totally a surreal body life experience. And the empathy that I gave her and that she gave back to us is something that and not only her, but every other family that had similar story or a different story, it just like accumulated that sense of purpose. And I now do what I do, and I feel so fulfilled for what I've done and for what I want to still do because of moments like those. There were a few moments like those with different people with horrific stories like that. And if it hadn't been for those moments, I don't know if I would have felt so deep the desire to work with impact, and if I would have been so happy having a passion and an objective. I would be maybe floating through life rather than going after something. So, yeah.
I'm so moved by that story, and it makes me think it's an insane story, and there's probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are in circumstances not of their own making, where they're just the victim of poverty, and make life choices the best the way that they can under the circumstances of their lives. But if given opportunities to make different choices, would. And I feel like more of us need to get out of our bubbles, out of our, you started off, I remember in the very early part of the interview, you said when you went for the first time, you were like, it made you realize that your problems were just like not that big a problem. Get over yourself and just like get on with things. And I really feel like we need to have that collective experience of saying like, we got to get over ourselves. Like what the lives that we're living now can be so much more meaningful as we are also in partnership with others, helping others have more fulfilling lives.
And so much more happier. When you realize that your problems are so small, because we aggrandize, I don't think that's a word, but I think I just created it. But anyways, the way when we explode our own sadnesses and stresses, because we, I think humans need a bit of drama in their lives. And so when you're and so because of the circle that you surround yourself with, you kind of stay with, and you think that that's a huge problem. And then you go and you experience something totally different and you realize, no, it's not. And that makes you so much happier. And yeah, I mean, like there's just so many stories. It's just like, it was an insane experience. I'm very lucky. But yeah.
Well, you're lucky, but you also said happy. And I feel like that's what's emanating from you. You look like a very, very happy, fulfilled, inspired person, out changing the world. Congratulations on everything you've done. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation, sharing all your insights and your experience. Good luck with the company. We'll be following you. We'll include information about Auxilium and the other company in the description below. And thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's honestly an honor. Like after having the best class at McGill, coming back like all these years later and having a chat and your podcast is a true honor. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, you're sweet, Isa. Thank you guys, everybody. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free from your thinking clutter and make important decisions and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.com and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.